All right.
Got it. Okay. Welcome, everybody. It's September 2nd. Hello. Yeah. Today is the meeting of the Finance Committee. Thank you all for taking time today to meet with us. I do want to say a special welcome to Elaine Walker. Welcome to the council. Appreciate seeing you here.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to sit in on this meeting and get more information about the organization. I'm honored to be a member.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so we will start with a call to order and a roll call. So Heather, if you want to do the roll call, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. Mr. Colby Burks.
I'm here.
Mr. Eric Ferris.
I'm here too.
Sheriff Lucas Menzer.
Here.
Mr. Richard Nelson.
Here.
Mr. Madison Silvert.
Here.
Dr. Robert Stack.
Here.
You have 100% attendance, and Ms. Walker, I will make note of your attendance as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all. The minutes of our last meeting are posted in passageways. Oh, I just clicked the wrong link. There he goes. Okay. Are there any questions about the minutes as posted?
Move to approve.
Motion by Dr. Stat. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Burks. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, like sign. All right, minutes are approved. I always do recommend checking out the minutes before the meeting. I always do that, a few minutes before the meeting. It always helps kind of jog my memory of the things that we talked about before. So that's just a helpful tip that I do personally. Normally, you too? Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah, comes with age. I can't remember all these things, right? That's why we write it down. Normally in the agenda, this would be the time that we get an update from Dr. Thompson. He is not with us today. He got pulled into the KSU meeting. So the next item, Heather, I'm assuming that Dr. Thompson was going to talk about the Commission on Race and Access Opportunity and Capital Planning Advisory Board presentation.
He was, but I believe Dr. Payne's going to do so.
Okay.
Yeah,
Dr.
if
Payne,
that's
go right
okay
ahead.
with you, Chairman, sir, I was going to just give
That'd be great.
highlights and not go into great detail on this.
No, go right ahead.
And before I start on that particular agenda item, I will just say, good afternoon, Chair Menzer and other members of the Finance Committee. As you can see from the agenda, there are no action items for today. These are all updates on various topics. And so we do anticipate a short meeting today. And certainly since I'll be standing in for Dr. Thompson, giving the updates that he was going to give, I'll be a lot more briefer in my comments than President Thompson probably would have been. Included in your packets are two presentations that President Thompson recently gave before legislative committees. One was the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity, and the other was the Capital Planning Advisory Board. And as I indicated a minute ago, I'm not going to go through these PowerPoint slides in any detail, but I do want to give you just a few highlights. It was on August 18th that President Thompson testified before this newly created Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity. And at that meeting, he provided an update on progress made closing Kentucky's opportunity gaps. That update included information on recent gains in underrepresented minority enrollment, retention, and completion. And in terms of some of the highlights that are contained in this presentation, I'm not even going to show you the slides, but underrepresented minority enrollment is up 6.4% since 2011-12, and that's compared to a drop of nearly 16% in total enrollment. So our underrepresented minorities are attending college in Kentucky at a higher rate than the overall population. Underrepresented minority retention rates are up 13.2 percentage points compared to an 8% percentage point increase overall since 2011-12. And then lastly, URM degrees and credentials are up by 60% over that time period, compared to 30% for all degrees and credentials. And at that commission meeting, President Thompson did stress that these gains were fueled by the council's policy for diversity, equity, inclusion, financial incentives that are embedded in the performance funding model, and then also the council's strategic agenda for post-secondary education. And I feel like his presentation was very well received. He did a fantastic job, as he always does. And so that was a good day before that commission. On that same day, and this just shows you how busy President Thompson's schedule has become since the fall opening of our colleges and universities. He also gave another presentation on that same day before the Capital Planning Advisory Board. You can see that presentation on your screen now. At that meeting, CPE was asked to identify capital investment priorities for the upcoming biennium for both the post-secondary institutions and for our agency. Now, all of the numbers that we presented at that meeting were preliminary, and we stressed to the board members that CPE staff had not fully vetted those draft priorities with either campus officials or with our own board. And so that those numbers are likely to change. As you know, we don't submit our final biennial budget recommendation to the Governor and General Assembly until November 15th of this year. I am going to share just a few of the slides from this presentation. So if you'll go to slide 7, Ryan, and there we are. As you can see in this slide, the blue bars represent new and expanded space for E&G facilities in Kentucky at our public post-secondary institutions. The yellow bars represent investment in asset preservation and renovation. And as you can see in those bullets over to the left, over the past 12 biennia, the state has invested $1.7 billion in new and expanded E&G facilities and $514 million in asset preservation projects. So in other words, there's been about 3 times more spending on new construction than there has been on asset preservation during this time period. And this is one reason this past biennium and the biennium before that, we only made a recommendation for new funding for asset preservation. We did not include in the council's biennial budget request any ask for new construction projects.
Dr. Payne, real quick,
Yeah.
on how does Kentucky compare? And we may not know the answer. Yeah, on this one, how do we compare to other states as far as that blend? Because I always hear in a lot of our meetings the new construction versus asset preservation. Are we an abnormality? Are we like on track? Do we think this is an issue, or is this just information at that level?
Well, it's been 2 or 3 years since I looked at what other states are doing in terms of, the mix of new construction versus asset preservation. When we did last look, there was more balance in other states. And that was actually part of the recommendations that came out of that BFA study that was done in 2007, which we had BFA update in 2013. They said Kentucky needs to have a more balanced approach. And based on the growth in research expenditures, and just research in general at our 2 research campuses, and based on enrollment growth,
Mm-hmm.
there really needed to be about a 50-50 balance in going forward in terms of new construction and asset preservation. Now,
Gotcha.
council members know over the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen an enrollment decline. And that has factored into President Thompson and CPE senior leadership's decision to come forward to the council and recommend just investment in asset preservation at this point, because we have not had growing enrollment that we did, in the early 2000s.
I gotcha.
But most states do have more of a 50-50 balance in
More
terms
balance.
of construction versus asset preservation.
Okay. Thank you.
One point to add to that, Bill, too. So for the council members, the SHIO organizations, State Higher Education Executive Officers, if you guys are familiar with the report they publish on the State Higher Education Finance Survey that they do every year, and our team tracks really closely with and actually fills out the surveys. This topic has become such a big issue that this upcoming submission that we'll be putting in for this year will actually break down capital appropriations for post-secondary education. So SHEF itself has really realized that this is a big big item that they want to be more involved with. So hopefully after this year, we'll have some even better data and very recent data as well for being able to compare us to other states.
Bill, question here is, have many of the schools taken up the asset preservation as far as charging students, that sort of thing? We had something along those lines a year or two ago, but I haven't heard much about it.
Yes, Dr. Stat, that is correct. About half of our institutions have implemented an asset preservation fee, the proceeds from which are restricted to invest in asset preservation projects on those respective campuses. We're in the process of working with the CBOs to gather information so that we can bring an update before the council, if not at this coming meeting, maybe at the February meeting, because we've got a lot on the agenda for this coming November. But yes, we'll be bringing a report updating you on not only the asset preservation fee, but the special use fees, as you know, which are voted on by students,
Right.
to impose a fee on themselves for capital projects that benefit students, and then also the Build Smart fee at KCTCS. Those are the three fees that are our mandatory fees that we extract during the tuition setting process from the total tuition and fee charge. And we do not allow those fees to go up if there's an increase in tuition and fees that is approved by the council. We maintain a fixed amount of the fee at those institutions that either have a special use fee, asset preservation fee, or the Build Smart fee at KCTCS.
The asset preservation fee that could be charged, will that even make a dent in this total picture?
Honestly, it won't. And we're going to have a slide in just a minute that shows you how
Okay.
the issue that we're really facing. Go to the next slide, if you would, Ryan, slide 8. So this was the draft capital request for the post-secondary institutions that we shared with the Capital Planning Advisory Board. As you can see, at this stage in the process, we indicated that the preliminary discussions with campus CBOs and campus presidents and President Thompson's thinking is that we should go with a larger ask for the upcoming biennium than we did for the current biennium. As some of the board members on this call may remember, we requested $200 million each year for a total of $400 million over the biennium 2 years ago. And so we have bumped that up to $350 million each year for a total state funded ask of $700 million. And just to give you some sense, Dr. Stat, this gets to your question a moment ago, to give you some sense of scale, with a $7 billion need for asset preservation to bring our current facilities up to industry standards, that would be a 10% spending level against a $7 billion need. We did have at least 3 institutions, either through their CBOs or through their campus presidents, that said for this upcoming biennium, they might be interested in including in the council's biennial budget recommendation and ask for some new construction projects. And so Sean McKiernan and Ryan are working with the CBOs and are compiling a list of their top new construction project and what is the scope of that project and what's the mix of state funding versus other funding sources. And so we're putting that list together so that we can go back to the CBOs and to the presidents and say, is this something that we want to do or not? And we would certainly welcome input from our council members on this particular issue. Because as you may remember, Chair Menser, 2 years ago, we had the chair of the Finance Committee and 1 or 2 other committee members that had some pretty definitive ideas that, no, we ought to just stick with just an asset preservation ask and not have any requests for new funding or any additional funding for new construction. Also included for this upcoming biennium is $80 million for technology infrastructure. If there's one thing that this pandemic has showed us, as a number of our institutions had to transition to 100% online learning, is that some of the fiber networks and the nodes and, just the academic computing in general on some of our campuses, that infrastructure is outdated. And so we've got a request included for $80 million in technology infrastructure. So at this point in the process, like I said, this is very preliminary. And we're going to continue to have discussions with our campus CBOs, and President Thompson is going to have discussions with campus presidents and with members of the finance committee as we move forward in this process to fine tune our capital investment request. Any questions at this point? Okay, Ryan, if you go to slide 11, in terms of the rationale for this preliminary request, we've already touched on the fact that, based on VFA study projections, by 2021, we were projected to reach a $7.3 billion total asset preservation need for our public post-secondary system. And there has been very minimal state investment since 2008. A total of 281 million state dollars, or about 3.8% of that total need, has been invested in asset preservation. And these next 3 points are very important. That investment is needed to maintain the value, functionality, and safety of state-owned facilities. These are state-owned facilities, and it's really vital that we get the state to begin to realize that our facilities are just getting older with every passing year, and construction costs are going up, as you can see in that last bullet. They've been going up by 3 to 6% per year. Interest rates are still fairly low at this particular time. The state has, $1.1 to $1.2 billion revenue surplus. The timing couldn't be better to really invest in our post-secondary education facilities, particularly our existing facilities. If you would, Ryan, go to slide 12. And this is what I was talking about, Dr. Stats. This chart shows the VFA study projections that were updated in 2013. And they show 3 4-year time periods, starting with 2007 to 2011. And that third time period, of course, is 2017 to 2021. And basically what VFA study found was that if there was no significant investment, either on the part of the state or on the part of our institutions, our asset preservation need would grow to $7.3 billion by 2021. And then if you look over to the right, you can see that over the past 7 biennia, there's only been a $281 million investment on the part of the state of Kentucky in asset preservation projects. And that's only about 3.8% of that projected $7.3 billion total.
Well, Bill, just tongue in cheek here, is there any way we can name some of this asset preservation after politicians, get their name up on it?
That's something that we'll have to look into. I know that used to happen in terms of some of the new facilities that were.
That's why they do the new ones, so they can get their name on it.
And I even remember a bill, I want to say it was 8 to 10 years ago, where they were going to try to prohibit universities from naming facilities after legislators. I don't know if that actually ended up passing or not. I kind of have a sense that it didn't pass. But we'll certainly look into that, Dr. Stat.
Okay.
And I've got and this, I may just be flexing my ignorance here. So the way I'm reading this is between 2017 and 2021, there's a preservation need of 7.3 billion. And on the right side, so far, the state has allocated 281 million, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge gap that will never be closed. And so I guess the question is, if there's really what are the universities doing? I mean, if they really had 7.3 billion, are the buildings just going unpreserved? I mean, it just seems like if it was that big of a gap, the universities would have to find ways of finding that. The gap is so big, it just begs a lot of questions. Like, what are they doing?
Well, and we will get an updated figure for you, but
Sure.
as of 2 years ago, ask the institutions over this same time period, what has been your level of investment in asset preservation? And we totaled up the cumulative amount of spending on the part of our institutions, and it was 815 million.
Gotcha.
If there's an emergency, the campus is, through the asset preservation fees, obviously one vehicle, or just through their unrestricted annual giving or their unrestricted tuition and fee revenue. If it's something of an emergency nature, they either have to dip into their campus reserves to address it, or issue agency bonds and finance it with debt and get those, emergency type projects addressed.
Yeah.
Has been some level of investment on the part of our institutions.
Sure.
It really needs to be a partnership between the state, the institutions, and students and families. All three need to share in the expense of renovating and renewing these facilities. Ryan, if you'll go to slide 23. And I'm going to just touch on this quickly. This is what we put before the Capital Planning Advisory Board in terms of the draft capital request for our CPE agency budget. And there's only 2 projects, as you can see. A student portal, also referred to as the College to Career Pathways portal, a $2 million request, and then upgrade the Kentucky Regional Optical Network, which is $1 million. In terms of that student portal, if it ended up being authorized by the General Assembly and the governor, that particular project would facilitate course and program comparisons across institutions. It would facilitate the transfer of credits, and then also credit for prior learning. And I want to say that we've already sort of initiated that process with $50,000 of CPE dollars. We've been wanting to do this for the last couple of bienniums in terms of that student portal, and we're going to get that underway. But it certainly would be helpful if the state would provide some funding to help support that project. So that's everything I had in terms of the 2 presentations that President Thompson and other CPE staff gave before the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity and the Capital Planning Advisory Board. The next item on the agenda, Chair Mincer, is the annual budget development update. Do I have your okay to go ahead and proceed with that?
Sure. Let me pause. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Payne on the last 2 presentations?
Mr. Chair, would it be appropriate for me to ask a question, even though I'm not a member of the commission?
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
As former Commissioner of Parks, one of the things we dealt with regularly was all of the costs associated with new construction that were never part of the budget. When the institutions request funding for new construction, do they write into their budget the ongoing maintenance and upkeep of those new institutions? Because when we would get 6 new golf courses, they never thought about staffing them and maintaining them and outfitting them. Is that part of their budget process?
Well, it certainly used to be up until about 2008-10, because, there was sort of a new capital construction growth phase, if you will, between the year 2000 and 2010. And during that time period, the state of Kentucky would provide maintenance and operation funding that would be part of the institutional operating budget, because those funds are recurring. And beginning in 2008-10, that was the last year that we received partial funding of a request that was related to maintenance and operation of facilities. And so ever since 2010, with for about 2 bienniums, we continued to ask for M&O funding. At the same time, we were asking for funding for new capital construction projects, and the M&O was not funded. And honestly, what they ended up doing in 2008-10 was they funded half of what was requested. And I think the logic was the institutions have tuition and fee revenue, and why should the state be the sole entity that's funding all of the maintenance and operations on those buildings? And that gets back to what I said a minute ago. It's really a partnership between the state, the students and their families, and the institutions, not only to fund asset preservation on existing facilities, but to also help fund the maintenance and operations, ongoing maintenance and operations of those facilities.
Thank you.
If you'll pull up table 1,
Go ahead.
Ryan, this is information that we shared yesterday with our campus presidents, and we shared it back on 19th with the campus chief budget officers. Some of you that have been through this biennial budget process before already know this, but I'll remind some of our newer members that you have to have a starting point if you're going to be adding additional dollars. You say, what is your base for the current year? And then what additional dollars do you need each of the upcoming years of the biennium? And so what this table is showing is that calculated beginning base for the 2022-24 biennium. And what it essentially is the 2021-22 or the current year, what we call the net general fund, which is shown in column F highlighted in yellow. And so what we've done here is we started with the enacted regular appropriation. Those numbers come right out of the budget bill. It's for each of the 8 universities, KCTCS, and then as you can see on that bottom row, it does include the performance fund, the post-secondary education performance fund, and there was a $17.3 million appropriation for the performance fund in the current year. Column B shows the distribution of that performance fund. So we zero out or have a negative 17.3 million in the performance fund and show those dollars distributed to the institutions that earn those funds in column B. If you add A and B together, that shows the total general fund for each institution for the current year. And of course, once the performance funds are distributed, there's zero remaining in that account. Column D backs out the debt service that was provided to the University of Kentucky and Kentucky State University, hence the term net general fund. It's net of debt service. And as some of you may recall, we had a performance funding work group that completed its work just 3 or 4 months ago. And as part of that, the work of that working group, the recommendation was to make an adjustment to the performance funding statute, KRS 164.092. And what one of those changes recommended and ended up being enacted into law was that any funding earned by an institution would not become recurring to that institution. They would receive those funds on a non-recurring basis, but then the funds would be put back into the performance fund. And that's what column E is showing, is that those dollars earned in the current year are now deducted out of the base of each institution and put back into the performance fund so that that $17.3 million base can go forward into the next biennium. And that's how we arrive at the column highlighted in yellow, and that is the beginning base for this upcoming biennium. Does anybody have any questions about that? And you'll see these numbers again as we begin to develop our biennial budget recommendation agenda items. You'll see a number of tables that will show that beginning base and how many additional funds are we requesting for 2022-23 and for 2023-24. And each of those years of the upcoming biennium are compared back to the current year base.
Any questions there?
Okay, Ryan, if you'll go to table 2, and you've seen some of these numbers before, particularly in terms of the capital investment request. This is as of September 1st, yesterday. We shared this with the campus presidents. And to this point, we only have 3 major funding components that have kind of risen to the top through those discussions with chief budget officers and campus presidents. One is performance funding, the other is asset preservation, and then the third, of course, is technology infrastructure. In terms of performance funding, right now, we're showing a potential ask of $67.5 million in the first year of the upcoming biennium, 90 million in the second year. And of course that, 90 million includes the 67.5, from the previous year. But the biennial total would be $157.5 million. As you can see in footnote number 1, the last sentence in that footnote, this request represents increases of 7.4% and 9.9% respectively. What we recommended 2 years ago was roughly about 5% in the first year and about 7% in the second year. And so we've increased the level of the ask for this upcoming biennium. And again, this is in recognition that over the past 12 or 13 years, we've had 11 years with either an enacted budget reduction or a mid-year budget cut. And so it was only in this current year that our institutions finally got some additional funding. That's $17.3 million that was appropriated to the performance pool and distributed to those institutions. And then also about between 21 and 22 million in pension funding for our comprehensive universities and KCTCS. Those are the only significant new funds that our institutions have received since the 2008-10 biennium. We've got a place. Yeah, question?
Yeah, what was the ask last year? I see we got the performance funding of 17 million. What was the ask?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Dr. Stat.
What was the ask last year? We got 17 million. How does that compare with what we asked for?
Oh, gosh. Let me minimize this.
That's all right. I was just looking for comparison because you're asking for what, 60 and
I'm almost sure it was like 37.5 million and close to 60 million. But I've got it here on my desktop. I just need to be able to minimize my screen here and find it, and I will do that momentarily.
No, that's fine. I was just wondering how much the legislature really cut our ask.
But now they didn't come close to funding what we had requested because we got $0 in the first year of this current biennium. And of course, as you know, they only adopted a one-year budget, and then they came back in 2021-22 and adopted the second year of the budget, and they had that 17.3 million. So that's what they funded, was the 17.3 million.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure we asked for about 37.5, but I'll verify that here in just a moment.
That's fine.
We've already, and just so you know, in that footnote 1, the first 2 or 3 sentences really lay out in summary form, the rationale for the performance funding dollars and why our campuses need those dollars. Performance funding is what is providing those incentives to increase student success and course completion outcomes. And we're seeing tremendous results as a result of those financial incentives. But the other thing that's important, if the General Assembly chooses to appropriate additional dollars to performance funding, it allows us to help maintain affordability and access for Kentucky citizens. Because any additional funding that the state can provide that relieves budgetary pressures on the institutions, they don't have to raise their tuition and fees to the same extent that they would need to if there was a budget cut. And so it really does help us maintain affordability and access. And also it's helping us to continue to make progress toward that 60 by 30 college attainment goal. In terms of that placeholder for KSU, the award that they received for their federal land grant program, the federal award that they received for their land grant program goes up every biennium. And so we're waiting on KSU to get the award letter. It usually comes out in early October. And so there's probably going to be an increase in their land grant program funding from the federal government. And there's a dollar for dollar match. And thank you for highlighting that, Ryan. There's already $8.2 million in KSU's base that is considered a mandated program, and that's the federal dollars. And then the state matches that $8.2 million for dollar. And KSU did receive about, I want to say it was $1.3 million increase during this current biennium because of an increase in the federal award that they received and the dollar for dollar matching requirement. In terms of that $700 million bond issue for asset preservation, because there is a $1.1 or $1.2 million surplus at the state level, that could be cash funded for this upcoming biennium if the General Assembly chose to do so. We are recommending at this point that these funds be matched 50 cents on the dollar. In previous bienniums, sometimes there has been a dollar for dollar match in terms of asset preservation pool funding. Another year, there was a differential between the research sector and the comprehensive sector. I want to say the research sector, it was like 80 cents on the dollar or 70 cents on the dollar, and the comprehensive universities were about 10 cents on the dollar less than the research institutions in terms of that match. And Ryan's highlighting a very important thing right now in the footnote. With the 700 million, if it's authorized, and with a 50 cents on the dollar match, that $1.5 billion total would address about 15% of a $7 billion need. And so if we were able to do that and maintain that level of commitment from the state and from the institutions over the next 6 bienniums, we could address about 90% of that $7 billion need if we could maintain or sustain that level of funding. If you would, Ryan, scroll down to the bottom third of the page. These are some additional components that are being considered by CPE staff and being discussed by CPE staff and campus CBOs and campus presidents. We've had 2 or 3 institutions, comprehensive universities, that have indicated that during this transition toward a level dollar allocation method of determining pension contributions, the General Assembly provided in the current year funding that was intended to cover 100% of the cost of that transition. And there are several institutions that said they got shorted, not by much, but one institution said about $300,000 short of covering 100% of that transition cost. Another institution said a number maybe as high as $900,000. But they're asking for a current year appropriation, which could be enacted in this upcoming budget bill. It's essentially saying go back in the current year and add an additional $300,000 for one institution or $900,000 for another. So that's one thing that's being discussed and considered. As I indicated earlier, there are at least 3 institutions that have indicated they would like to come forward with their highest priority new construction capital project. And what President Thompson has communicated to all of the presidents that if you do come forward with a new construction project and you want the council to consider including that in their biennial budget recommendation, there better be some pretty strong rationale for it. In other words, you've got a growing program and you've got more students than the space would allow, and so you need to expand a facility or something of that nature. But if it's not contributing to our student success goals with some pretty strong rationale, President Thompson at this point is thinking that it would not be included in our budget recommendation. We've had one chief budget officer that has asked us to consider a 5th round of funding for Bucks for Brains. We did recommend 2 years ago a Bucks for Brains appropriation, and several council members on the finance committee voted in favor of that, and then the majority voted against it, and so we did not include a round of funding for Bucks for Brains in the current biennium. The argument made by that chief budget officer is that with the revenue surplus at the state level, this would be a really good time to invest in research at our 2 research campuses. And in fact, some of you may recall back in 2002, the first round of funding for Bucks for Brains, it was $110 million in total, $10 million for the comprehensive universities, $100 million for the 2 research campuses. That was cash funded. because there was a revenue surplus that biennium. And after the budget bill was enacted, they came back and enacted a supplemental appropriations bill. And that's how that first round of funding for Bucks for Brains came about. And considering the return on investment for university research, if you've got surplus revenues like the state has at this time, it's certainly worth the discussion and worth consideration.
Last year
Yes.
we had, I believe it was last year, we had very good presentations from both U of L and UK on the return of investment on the Bucks for Brains, and it might be worth repeating.
Any other comments or questions about this update on the biennial budget development process? And not just comments. We would really like to hear from you. Does any council member have an issue with any of the components that we're discussing or any of the funding amounts? Or is there some component that, you know, a council member would like to put on the table for us to consider? Because this ultimately is your biennial budget recommendation.
Any questions, comments, especially anybody that's new to the finance committee? Go ahead,
Actually,
Dr. Stat.
okay, just something that popped into my mind. We have a very big deficit in preservation at the university campuses. Do you have any feel for what the preservation status is of non-university state buildings?
I do not, Dr. Stat.
Okay.
To speak to that though, then this is kind of getting at your question. A lot of you guys know, obviously, with the executive order with KSU, we have a financial health assessment that we are doing. And our team has actually been working on creating a tool based on some standard publications with a lot of different financial ratios, et cetera. And one of those things that we do hope to eventually roll out with our institutions and in partnership with them, one of the metrics actually is an age of facilities metric. And so there are industry standards for institutions, also based on whether they're research institutions or liberal arts universities. And so our hope is as we start to build out some of this other stuff as well, that'll be helpful in informing our asset preservation requests going forward as well, using really objective and agreed upon industry standards specifically for higher education.
Very good.
Ryan, would you scroll back down to the bottom of the page? I want to just make our council members aware of something, one other component that was just proposed to me this morning, literally. But one of the CBOs contacted me, specifically the KCTCS Chief Budget Officer, and said that, you know, if there's going to be consideration of an endowment match program recommendation, which KCTCS does not participate in. I think some of our council members on the finance committee already know this, but by statute, there were 6 original strategic incentive and investment trust funds that were created. One was the Research Challenge Trust Fund, which was for the 2 research campuses. Back in the day, it was called the Regional University Excellence Trust Fund. I believe now it's called the Comprehensive University Excellence Trust Fund. But then there was also the Workforce Development Trust Fund, which was for KCTCS. So they created 3 trust funds in which dollars could be appropriated for programs like Bucks for Brains. And there were actually some workforce development initiatives back in the early 2000s that were funded through that trust fund. And so KCTCS has reached out to me, and their president is going to reach out to President Thompson and said that they would be interested in some kind of a trust fund appropriation for KCTCS, since they do not participate in the Bucks for Brains program. So I just wanted to give you a heads up on that. I didn't have time to add that bullet to the bottom of this page because literally I got off that call and had to jump on this one. But we're going to be having some discussions about that as well going forward.
Can I ask, this doesn't contemplate any additional funding as to CPE itself, right? I mean, there's nothing that we look at insofar as improving what we could do in support of the institutions with some additional funding.
No, this is strictly looking at institutional operating funds and capital investment, both in asset preservation, potentially new construction, and maybe even trust funds at our post-secondary institutions. And so we haven't given you a summary of what we're looking at other than what you saw in that presentation to the Capital Planning Advisory Board. That's what we would recommend for this upcoming biennium for our agency operating budget in terms of capital investment. But we have not put together a final budget request for any additional dollars for our agency budget at this time. But we are having those conversations internally. And I will tell you that in the state budget picture has been so bleak over the past decade that for the most part, we've just asked that we not be cut. But given the revenue surplus, this may be a good time to think about what are some targeted dollars that we could request that could be housed in the CPE agency budget to help us achieve our strategic agenda. And in fact, President Thompson has instructed me and my staff to work with Lee Nemec and Travis Powell and Melissa Bell and our senior leadership team, Amanda, and come up with some proposals, for some strategic things that we could do to move our agenda forward. And so we will be coming at the next Finance Committee meeting with a fairly detailed plan of what we need to include in our agency budget ask as well. So I'm glad you brought up that question because we're working on it. We just didn't, put anything in front of you here today.
That's okay. Thank you.
Just a few, I guess, observations or questions. It sounds like last year we received about 45% or so of the request. Assuming that this number is not a negotiation, but is a real number. I'm curious that if that's a pretty consistent percentage of our ask that's granted, or if that was an unusual year, and if so, how do we bridge that gap between always being kind of given this cut and make sure that people recognize that some of this funding that you're talking about here is about the long-term sustainability of our campuses and the ability to adequately educate our population. Because I don't think that if our number is a real number, and I believe it is, that consistently funding it at half or less of the need is going to be long-term sustainable for the state. The second piece that I'd ask is just, I know in my business, when I develop a new hotel, for example, there is a requirement that a percentage of my revenues are held back for future improvements. The understanding that at some point you're going to have to reinvest in your building, and so we're actually required to hold money back by the franchisor. And do we have any such requirements of state university budgets?
CPE does not have a policy that requires that. No, to answer your second question, that doesn't mean that it doesn't occur in the budgeting process in some of our campuses. I would anticipate, that they factored that into their annual budgeting process. The difference, and I know you already know this, whether it's agency bond funded or state funded or some combination of the two, the investment in the capital project, whether it be a renovation and renewal project whether it be an expansion of an existing facility or a totally new facility that's being constructed. Those are one-time dollars that are expended. And of course, the maintenance and operating costs are ongoing. And that's why I say those M&O costs used to be requested as part of the institutional operating budget and were paid for by the state. In other words, the state gave us 100% of the dollars needed to help maintain those buildings. And as I indicated, starting in 2008-10, they went to more of a 50 cents on the dollar approach and reduced what we asked for. And then for 2 or 3 bienniums, we continue to ask for maintenance and operating funding, and they just essentially adopted a policy, or at least a practice, that we see all around the country. I mean, Kentucky was one of the last few states that was continuing to fund 100% of that maintenance and operating cost of new E&G facilities. And so the state has more or less just said it's on our institutions to find a way to maintain those buildings. And so, of course, in every institution's operating budget, they plan for what those M&O costs are going to be and budget for that. But we don't have any policy that requires them to do that. They do that automatically.
But when they justify are justifying the development cost of a new facility, for example, do we have any overview of that whatsoever? I would assume as part of their budgets, we do. And when they do that, do they try to create some net present value of future M&O costs as to part of that construction budget?
I can speak to this a little bit. So they do actually, as part of the requirement for any capital appropriations, they have to submit an impact on the budget that they will have, which would include the maintenance and operations going forward. So if there's a capital appropriation that they're requesting, they do have to have a separate field within the Kentucky budgeting system that does outline, this is what the impact of this is going to be on our budget long-term. But that also includes revenues that will generate as well as expenses.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you. That's very good.
Hey, Ryan, am I able to, if I want to do so, am I able to take over and share my screen for a second?
Yes, I will stop sharing. You should be good to go.
Dr. Stat, this is what was recommended for the 2020-22 biennial budget recommendation. I was saying 35.7. That shows, that your memory is the second thing to go, I guess, as you get older. But it was actually 52.5 and 75 million. And I had said it was about 5% and 7.5%. But as you can see in footnote 1, it was 6.2% was what we asked for in the first year of the current biennium, and almost a 9% increase over the 2019-20 base in the second year. So it was roughly 53 million in the first year and 75 million in the second. And so now we're at 67.5 and 90. So we have bumped up that ask a little bit.
Yeah, but who knows what we'll get?
Well, and I think this the gentleman that just asked that question, I'm looking for his name. Is it Silbert?
Yes, sir.
Member Silbert, would you go back? My answer to your second question was so lengthy. I need you to remind me, what was your first question?
Well, the first question was really about kind of historically, and you spoke to this starting about 8-10, where it looked like we were getting about 50% of what we were asking for. At what point do we just ask for 200% of what we need in hopes of getting 100%?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I remember how I was going to respond to this question. Yeah, in 2008-10 was the last year that we got any M&O funding, and honestly, since 2008 through this most recent year, this current year, as I indicated earlier, it's almost been a continuous budget cut mode, either through enacted budget reductions or mid-year budget cuts. we have said a number of times, we've had 11 budget cuts in 13 years since 2008. And so there has, even though we have asked for what CPE staff, CPE council members, and our post-secondary institution leaders feel like is what is needed to continue to make progress, toward our House Bill 1 goals and our strategic agenda goals and objectives, and what is needed to maintain affordability and access for our students. Not only have we not received any of those additional funds that we've requested, we've been cut almost every single year since 2008. And that is not sustainable. I heard you mention the word, is it sustainable to only get half of what you asked for? We would have been very happy to get half of what we asked for every biennium. In reality, we got none of what we asked for in most cases and received budget cuts in lieu of any new funding. So in the interest of time, Chairman, would you like to move on to the last item on the agenda?
Yes, please.
And I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Kaffenberger, who's done a great job working with our campus CBOs and working with Office of State Budget Director staff to develop a set of templates for keeping track of some of these federal higher education relief dollars that have been coming into Kentucky to support our higher education institutions, but also in tracking down COVID-19 costs and foregone revenues. And I think we gave you guys an update on this about 5 or 6 months ago, but we've sort of reached a milestone with the end of this most recent fiscal year, this past June 30. And so we wanted to come back with you and provide you with another update on where we stand in terms of the revenues received and the cost and foregone revenues. So Ryan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So yeah, this is a lot of numbers, and I know this chart can be a tad overwhelming to go through. So I will walk us through kind of really almost every single column here. But as Bill mentioned, this is something that we're doing quarterly now with all of our chief budget officers, and something that I've been really able to work closely with all of them on. And so to give you a little bit of background, particularly for Ms. Walker, who's now on joining the council, and something that you guys will be seeing going forward in general. We structured this reporting based on the forms that are required of the institutions to submit to the granting authorities. So in the case of the federal funds, so CARES Act, HRSA, and ARP, the Department of Education has federal forms that are being used for all of these higher education emergency relief funds, which is the actual grant program award. And underneath those, they have items that are deemed as eligible uses. Very, very, very specific. I could give you examples of them if you guys would like those at the end of this kind of presentation when we have questions. But very, very detailed uses. And so we've basically created a tool that aggregates all of those awards that have been given into certain spreadsheets that match the awards to the eligible uses and those related costs and foregone revenues, and then maps those out by the fiscal year. This table you're looking at is a very high level summary and really ultimately gets at the story that we're wanting to tell, which is why we've kind of structured it the way it is. But ultimately, the other awards, so the GEAR awards, for instance, the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Funds, which were actually administered through CPE, we had our own reporting requirements and eligible uses for those. So the spreadsheet tracks those by those eligible uses. And then additionally, the coronavirus relief funds, which although that fund was technically created underneath the CARES Act, it is something that was given to the state to operate at their discretion. To allocate to agencies at their discretion. And so you guys, if you guys remember, in the last year in fiscal year 2021, there was a fund swap of $40 million to where $20 million was taken out of the institution's general fund. And then it was replaced with $40 million of coronavirus relief funds. And so obviously there's some great aspects of that, and that there was $20 million of extra funds given. And yet, at the same time, there was funds that were essentially unrestricted and eligible to be used for any purpose that were now replaced with $20 million of restricted funds that had very strict guidance on how they could be used. So there's a pro and con with that, obviously. That's what that $40 million total column is underneath the coronavirus relief funds. So underneath this, you'll see it's by act, the CARES Act, CRRSA, and ARP. So the ARP being the most recent, the American Rescue Plan. Those funds do include higher education emergency relief funds. So HEERF 1, HEERF 2, and HEERF 3. And then they also include Gear 1. So Gear 1 is in CARES Act, and then Gear 2 is under the CRRSA. ARP did not actually include any Gear funding. So there was no third round of funding in that. Beyond that, there are also different allocations that were made underneath each one of these for institutions under the Strengthening Institutions Program, and then additional funds also given for HBCUs as well. Those are all also included in these numbers. So essentially what's included is anything that is deemed institutional portion, meaning that it is used for the institutions, and that's as opposed to funds that were allocated to the institutions for use for student aid, specifically emergency financial aid grants, which for the most of these funds, that was a 50-50 split. The ARP is one of the exceptions to that, and the fact that it allocated even more to the student aid portions than under the CARES and CRRSA. Coronavirus relief funds, that fund swap by the state was completely 100% institutional portion and used to help the institutions with the additional costs that they had received as a result of COVID-19.
So Ryan, these are just the institutional funds, no funds
Yes.
allocated directly to students.
Yes, exactly. We do have the funds allocated to students if you guys would be interested in that. We are tracking that. We are more so tracking that at a point of saying we know what the minimum required portions are of each of the institutions, and we're tracking how much of that has actually been dispersed to the students. And so far to this point, we've seen that the majority of our institutions have allocated almost 100%, if not exactly at 100% of the student aid portions allocated under the CARES and CRRSA. ARP, again, being so recent, it is still being allocated as we're speaking and actually dispersed out to the students. So to keep going through, you'll see the really big green column with total awards. That is huge right there. The $476.3 million is the total amount of awards that have been given to institutions for institutional uses in attempts to address the additional costs and foregone revenues that have been created by the pandemic. And obviously this is to help them with their operations and not drain on the services that they're always normally going to be providing to their students just out of their normal base operations and their missions. The next column, and it's summarized in column B, which is those eligible costs and foregone revenue. So this is summarized and aggregated at a very high level based on all the eligible uses and how I described how this data is set up, the related costs, and then we have the lost revenue. And those are the ones that are deemed as eligible uses of funds by either the DOE, CPE, or the state under the CRF funds. So you'll see underneath those, just the eligible costs and foregone revenue far exceed the total award amounts, meaning that there's a very large deficit. And so those eligible costs of $638 million far exceed that $476 million. That's what that column C is, which is that federal awards. If it's a residual, it'll be showing a positive. If it has those parentheses around it, it's a deficit. And the only institution at this point that is showing a residual is KSU with 3.9 million. Every other ones, and you can see specifically the research institutions have borne a very, very large portion of this, but that's also to be expected with the healthcare natures of UK and U of L. But that federal award deficit totals down to $161.7 million. That's just the eligible uses based on what was deemed as reimbursable if you had the funds to reimburse everything under each one of these grant awards. That final column is important because we've identified it as ineligible in the sense that the uses were not specifically outlined within the DOE, CPE, or the state OSBD's guidance for how the relief funds could be used, meaning they're ineligible and they could not be reimbursed under the regulations. And yet, our chief budget officers at all of our institutions have identified and said these costs would not have happened, or these lost revenues would not have happened without COVID-19. And so the reality is we want to have the most complete picture, which is why we're breaking it down as this table shows. But when you factor that into, we have nearly a $200 million deficit. And so I'm kind of coining that a little bit as a net budgetary impact. But the reality is that's the burden that our institutions are having to face out of their reserve funding or other resources. And I know in many cases, some of them are looking for reimbursement from entities like FEMA and things like this to try to get as much of those costs taken care of as possible. But ultimately, this is the burden that our institutions are facing outside and in excess of those award amounts that were allocated. To show this,
Ryan, would you remind everybody that this is as of June 30, 2021, so as of the end of the most recent fiscal year, but these data are showing 3 fiscal years, 1920, 2021, and 2021-22. Can you tell them more about the 3 years of data?
Yeah, so absolutely. Sorry for overlooking that. So this is a really unique quarterly report. Like I said, we will do this every single quarter. But because of the way that this fell as of June 30th, 2021, we feel very confident, so do our chief budget officers, that the fiscal year 2019 to 20 and fiscal year 2020 to 21 are actual values, with the only caveat being that obviously a lot of these institutions are still finalizing and closing their books. But even with that, our institutions gave us great confidence in the fact that if there was any difference, it would be minor deviations from the numbers that they gave us for those 2 fiscal years. Now, the important thing is obviously fiscal year 2021 to 22 are projections. They're estimates, and as such, they're subject to change, which is why we're doing this quarterly. And obviously with the changing nature of the Delta variant going around right now, the impacts we're seeing across the Commonwealth, these things could change greatly. And so that is the caveat we're giving, but that's also why we're trying to do this quarterly, so that you guys will be really ahead of the ball as much as we can with you guys to see how much of the burden are our institutions bearing, because obviously this will also impact our biennial budget requests and any other asks on behalf of the institutions. So yes, fiscal year 2019-20 and 2020-21 are as close to actual as possible, with the only caveat being that some of the institutions have not officially formally closed their books for fiscal year 21. I do think it helps to see this visually. And so we do have a chart to kind of show this. And this is just showing the eligible costs and foregone revenues. So that final column of ineligible is not in these numbers, but you'll see the total award amounts in green, and you see the eligible costs and foregone revenue at each one of our institutions. CKCTCS also across the system has a very large deficit there, with I think in excess of about 17 million. And I do want to put this in perspective as well. So we've done figures on this based on the enacted fiscal year 21 general fund appropriations that each one of these institutions has received. And while it does show that UK and U of L are bearing a huge amount of the weight, when this deficit is compared to the net general fund appropriations that the institutions received back in fiscal year 21, they do receive they're about anywhere from 30 to 40%. But they're also in the comprehensive institutions. So Morehead State, you'll see there's a pretty substantial deficit there, and NKU are all around 35 to 38% of their deficit as related to their net general fund appropriation in fiscal year 21. So these are sizable amounts in terms of the revenue that they're receiving from the state as well. And so Morehead State was specifically driven a lot by, they had heavy impacts from COVID on reduced enrollment, which obviously is concerning because that is an impact that will not just affect this year, but will affect 4 years going on into the future for that cohort's entire college kind of journey. So ultimately, this is what we have to show you in terms of an update. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
How was it that KSU was able to have more awarded than eligible or foregone?
So a lot of that is given to the fact that they received funding. So each one of the HERE funds, so higher education emergency relief funds that were allocated under the CARES, CRISA, and ARP Act. Essentially, that's one grant program that each one of the acts just kept on dumping more money into and kind of kept on fueling. Now, underneath that, there are specific sections. So sections of the act that provide funding for different institutions that are one, so is the institutional portion in general that goes to all the higher ed public institutions. Then they also have specific programs for, like I said, there are specific institutions that are in the Strengthening Institutions program, which there's a separate section that gives more money to that. And then there's also another section that allocates to HBCUs. So there's that funding as well. In addition to that, there was also recently announced an additional $1.4 billion of institutional funds that the Biden administration is now allocating to HBCUs. So they just recently, and that's probably within the last month, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, that they got additional funding through the HBCUs section of the HERE funds, even above what was originally announced. So a lot of this is also the idea that projections are kind of hard. And the fact is that they've gotten a lot of this money immediately, and they're still trying to figure out what they're supposed to be doing with it. Additionally as well, so when you do see a residual, keep in mind that these are reimbursement funds, meaning that those funds are not available to the institutions unless they have incurred a cost, which they have already paid with their revenues, and they can therefore ask for a reimbursement from whoever the granting organization is. Now, one of the great things about the HERE funds is that the first line in the eligible uses is to provide additional emergency financial aid grants to students. So there's a minimum required portion, which is what I was saying that we have already begun tracking, but an additional line that the institutions can take advantage of is even above that minimum required portion, they can provide additional emergency financial aid grants to the institutions. And so ultimately our expectation and hope, and I think of the chief budget officers would agree with this as well, based on our conversations, is that if in theory there was any residual that was left, that money would go towards helping the students. So it will not just be lapsed and let to go to waste. Ultimately, they will leverage that for the good of their students and for their institution.
I wouldn't want to give the wrong impression to the legislature and KSU if we indeed need to come to them and ask for some additional help for KSU, which looks like maybe the case. That's the reason it's good to be able to explain that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you're absolutely right. I know even right now, Greg Rush has been doing a great job over there figuring out ways to supplement their revenue. So they've actually even figured out ways that they can leverage their student portion of financial aid to, again, increase retention and actually let a lot of that money obviously become tuition and fees that will be received by the university and be able to get their budget. Or obviously it will be expended out to the students to be able to meet cost of living needs and whatever they may need. So yes, it's a very nuanced story. You're absolutely right. We want to make sure the right story is conveyed.
Right, Ryan, as I recall from Aaron's presentation a month or so ago, KSU is down about 13 million. Will this money, can any of that be used to offset that 13 million?
So to the degree that possible, they are doing that right now. So that is in a huge regard, what I was just mentioning about the student portion of these funds. And so the financial aid grants that they can give, because KSU is also one of the institutions that has not fully allocated and dispersed out the student portions of their grants given to the minimum required portions as the CARES and CRISA and ARP have outlined. And so ultimately, like what I said, that's not necessarily going to be a dollar to dollar impact in terms of revenue to the institution. As much as that it can be substituted for tuition and fees to the degree, and in as much as it maintains retention, pays off student debt and loans that the institution has given out, it can ultimately become revenue to the institution. And so I can say confidently, just based on our conversations with Craig, that if there is any room for this funding to be able to be used to generate revenue that can be used for more general purposes in the institution's budget, they are looking into those to be able to use as much as possible.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Ryan or anything that we have presented here today? Ryan, if you will stop sharing it, we're going to back over to Chair Mincer.
Okay. Folks, any questions on the items that we've presented today? Okay. Folks, that is the agenda for today. So I can entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
All right. I'll give Mr. Ferris the motion, Dr. Stout the second. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. I think that's unanimous. Everyone have a great day. Thank you all.